You knew it was ready when the crust pulled away from the dish at the edges, that little gap your nan never measured but always got right. You understood without being told that the recipe lived in her hands, not on any card. Here are 30 British pies no one makes anymore. Before the Thames ran clean enough for leisure, it ran thick with eels, and every East London kitchen knew what to do with them. The eel pie that fed the Docklands came in a rough-edged pastry case, the filling dark and savoury, eel cut into short lengths, stewed with parsley until the bones softened enough to eat whole. Nothing wasted. Henry Blanchard opened the first proper pie and mash shop in Southwark in 1844, and by the end of that century, there were over 100 such shops across Greater London, the eels arriving from Dutch fishing boats at Billingsgate. By 2024, 34 remained. The eel population in the Thames fell from 1,500, counted in research traps in 2005, to just 50 in 2010. The pie survived. Minced beef crept in to replace what the water could not provide. But the women who knew the original, who made liquor from the eel stewing water itself, who judged doneness without looking, those women are gone, and no amount of mince gets the flavour back. The pie that helped feed a nation had no meat in it at all. Woolton pie was born in the kitchens of the Savoy Hotel in 1941, created by François Latry and published in the Times on the 26th of April that year. Potatoes, carrots, swede, cauliflower, oatmeal, vegetable extract, simmered, tipped into a pie dish, topped with potato pastry, and served with vegetable gravy. On paper, poverty dressed up in pastry. In practice, across millions of rationed kitchens, it became proof that a cook who understood her craft could stretch a ration book, allowing just 4 ounces of butter per person per week, into a proper meal. The women who made it best never followed Latry's recipe exactly. They adjusted by season, by what the allotment offered, by what the greengrocer had left. That improvisation was the real skill. You did not learn it from a newspaper. You learned it by watching. You rendered the dripping first, fat scraped from the roasting tin and stored in a stone crock by the cooker. When you had enough, you made the crust. Lard and dripping were rubbed into plain flour with cold hands, worked just until it came together. The mutton went in raw, seasoned hard with salt and white pepper. Cold water poured to within an inch of the brim. An hour and a quarter in a hot oven, sometimes more if the neck was tough. Charles Elmer Francatelli's Plain Cookery Book for the Working Classes, published in 1852, gave the quantities exactly: 1 1/4 pounds of flour, lard and butter combined, and 2 pounds of mutton. The crust was structural, built to trap the steam, hold the juice, feed you twice, once hot from the oven, once cold and sliced the next morning. That dripping tin by the cooker was the key to the whole operation. Once the habit of saving it went, the understanding of what pastry could do went with it. When rationing tightened and the butcher's window went bare, the countryside remembered what the town had forgotten. Pigeon was not rationed, neither was rabbit. In the wartime years, families who had never looked twice at a wood pigeon began baking them into pies with whatever the garden could offer. The breasts were stewed with onion and stock until the gravy darkened. The pin bones were worked out with patience. The flavour was unlike anything the ration book could provide: dark, close, rich. Wartime letters to newspapers debated whether pigeon ranked above rabbit. Some correspondents insisted the breast meat had a sweetness beef could never match. The allotment and the hedgerow fed whole streets the Ministry of Food could not. By the 1960s, when the shops filled with meat again, the pigeon stayed in the field. What necessity had taught a generation, abundance quietly erased. If pigeon pie was the countryside improvising under pressure, fidget pie was the Midlands, simply getting on with it. Practical and quietly excellent. It contains gammon, cooking apple, Onion and potato layered in a deep dish under a thick short crust, the sharp acidity of the fruit cutting through the salt of the ham in a way that balances itself. The Shropshire version called for a half pint of cider poured over the layers before the lid went on, steaming the filling from inside. You would know a Shropshire fidget from its Midlands cousins by that cider and the particular sweetness it brought. The name has 3 possible explanations. The ingredients shift while cooking. It was once 5-sided. Or it smells like a fidget in a hot oven. You did not measure the cider. You poured until it looked right, which meant you had watched someone do it many times before you trusted your own eye. The name is a misdirection that has confused people for centuries. Devonshire squab pie contains no squab, no pigeon of any kind. Jane Grigson believed the working people of Devon borrowed the name from the gentry who baked squab pigeons in rich pastry, then replaced the expensive birds with what they had: neck of lamb, sliced apples, onions, prunes, and mixed spice. The Devonshire mark was clotted cream, spooned at the table, or stirred into the gravy, a detail that separated this from the Gloucestershire and Somerset variants. What the cook understood, and the recipe could not convey, was the ratio. Too much prune turned it sweet enough for pudding, too little, and the fruit lost its purpose. You learned the balance by eating it made right, then making it wrong, then finding your way back. Originally a dish for farm labourers after a long day in the fields. The cream was not luxury, it was dairy country, and you used what surrounded you. What looked like extravagance was simply geography. In the textile towns of Yorkshire and Lancashire, the cheese and leek pie was as ordinary as a loaf of bread, and made just as seriously. Leeks sliced thin, sweated in butter until they collapsed to softness, mixed with strong, grated Wensleydale or Lancashire cheese, poured into a short crust case, and baked until the centre set with just the slightest give when you pressed it. The ingredients were cheap, far cheaper than meat, which was the point for households where the wage covered rent and fuel first. What the North understood, and the South never quite grasped, was that a well-made cheese and leek pie needed no apology. The sweetness of the cooked allium against the sharpness of the dairy gave it a depth that stood on its own. It was not vegetarian by ideology. It was thrifty by necessity and proud by practice. The woman who made it in your family had a version slightly different from your neighbours, and both differences mattered. That pie is slipping away now, along with the woman who understood it. Lancashire kept a secret the rest of England either forgot or never learned. On Fridays, when the Catholic mill workers could not eat meat, they made a better pie than most people ate on Sunday. The butter pie was onions and potatoes cooked slowly in butter until the onion turned sweet, packed into a deep short crust, and baked until the edges crisped gold. Known as Catholic pie, Friday pie, or simply a special. Walk into the right chip shop in Preston or Wigan and ask for a special without explaining yourself, and you'd get exactly what you meant. The religious restriction that created it became the pride that sustained it. From 2006, the butter pie was included in the World Pie Eating Championship in Wigan in the vegetarian category. Preston North End served them at Deepdale on match days for decades, until the supplier shut in 2007 and fans organised a campaign to bring them back. That is not the behaviour of people who consider a pie ordinary. She packed it before dawn and her husband took it into the field without a plate or fork. The Bedfordshire clanger told you everything the moment you picked it up. One end held the meat, gammon or pork, onion, potato. An internal suet pastry wall divided it from the sweet end, which held stewed apple or jam. 2 holes punched into the savoury end, 3 slits in the sweet end, the code that told you, in the half-dark of a lunch break in an open field, which way to start. Originally boiled in a muslin cloth like a suet pudding, the clanger was built from Sunday joint leftovers, nothing invented fresh. The name most likely came from the Northamptonshire dialect word meaning to eat with real hunger, which was precisely the kind of eating for which it was designed. Farm labourers across Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire depended on it through most of the 19th century. What looked like a simple pastry was 2 courses, no utensils, and a complete meal for people who had neither the time nor the means to eat any other way. Rabbit was the wartime cook's quiet advantage. No ration book, no coupon, and it cost next to nothing from any farm or hedgerow if you knew who to ask. Through the Second World War and into the 1950s, rabbit fed working-class families in a way the official ration never quite managed, braised with root vegetables and dried herbs under a sweet or short-crust lid that soaked up the thin, sweet gravy the meat produced. You jointed it yourself, the back legs and saddle giving the best meat, tender without long cooking, the flavour mild and clean in the way only wild-caught animals have. Then in the early 1950s, myxomatosis swept through the population, reducing it almost to nothing within a few years. The habit of rabbit pie never recovered. By the time supermarkets made other cheap protein available, the generation that had learned to skin and joint a rabbit as a matter of course had moved on, and the knowledge, like the animal, had stopped showing up. Long before rabbit found its way under pastry, every roasting bird in a British kitchen left behind something nobody threw away. The giblet pie was as much a part of the cooking week as the roast itself, with neck, gizzard, heart and liver simmered until the broth thickened and the flesh fell to threads. Peter Breers, researching the Wordsworth household, found Dorothy Wordsworth made giblet pie regularly for her circle, noting that most northern families added beef or mutton steaks to bulk the filling and absorb the deep giblet flavour. He wrote, "It was popular until the late 19th century. Then it vanished without ceremony. Once poultry arrived wrapped in cellophane, first with giblets bagged separately, and eventually without giblets at all, the whole premise dissolved. You can source the parts from a good butcher today and make the broth the proper way. It tastes right. It does not taste the same, because the hands that made it best are not in that kitchen anymore." The strangest pie in the British tradition has fish heads poking through the crust, gazing upward. The reason is not theatrical, it is entirely practical. In the Cornish village of Mousehole, the pilchards were arranged with their heads sticking out, so the oil they released during baking drained back down into the filling, keeping the pastry from going sodden. The heads were not decoration, they were the mechanism. The story holds that a fisherman named Tom Borcock sailed out alone on the 23rd of December through a fierce winter storm, when the village had gone weeks without a catch. Whether Tom Borcock was real could not be confirmed. Morton Nance, writing in the magazine Old Cornwall in 1927, documented that the festival predated the 20th century. Every year since, the Ship Inn serves stargazy pie on that date. 7 types of fish lie under the crust, whole pilchards poking through, and hard-boiled egg grated over the filling. The legend names sand eels, horse mackerel, pilchards, herring, dogfish, and ling. 6 fish, and a 7th nobody named. You did not ask. You ate and were grateful. The raised veal and ham pie was the crown of the Victorian cold table, not a Tuesday supper, not a wartime improvisation, but something made over 2 days with a degree of craft that most modern kitchens have entirely lost. You built the case first, pouring the hot water crust made with lard and boiling water, then moulding it by hand around a wooden dolly, working the warm dough up the sides before it cooled and stiffened. The filling was layers, raw veal and cured ham, seasoned with nutmeg and white pepper, packed tight. After baking, when the pie cooled, you poured clarified stock through the hole in the lid to fill the gap the shrinking meat had left. That setting jelly the next day was the mark of a well-made pie, what separated a genuine raised effort from something that merely looked the part. John Mollard's 1802 instructions gave the method for raised ham pie with directions for the standing crust specifically. The technique took nerve, a short window while the dough was workable, no adjusting once it's set. It cost nothing, took nerve to serve, and nobody who ate it admitted readily, which is most of the history of rook pie. The bird was not rationed during the Second World War, putting it back on the table for the first time in a generation, and the letters written to newspapers reveal a country in lively disagreement. Some correspondents insisted rook pie was as good as pigeon. Others held that confusion with crows, which eat carrion, made the whole enterprise suspect. The distinction mattered. Rooks feed on grain and grubs. The breast meat of young birds, shot in rookeries in late spring, the only humane harvest window, was mild enough to pass for pigeon by anyone not told otherwise. You skinned rather than plucked, removed the back to reduce the strong flavour, then braised the breasts low and slow before topping with pastry. What had been poverty food before the war briefly became a point of rural pride during it. By the 1950s, when rationing ended and the hedgerow was no longer the larder, rook went back to being something nobody mentioned. Nobody planned to invent hominy pie. It emerged in the 1940s from the circumstances of women building runways, digging drainage ditches, and driving tractors on rations never quite sufficient. The Women's Land Army worked the farms conscripted men had left, cooking in farm kitchens and hostels what they had: potatoes, leeks, rationed cheese, a little flour. No meat, and no complaint about its absence. The pie survived its origin and found an audience that never knew the one who built it. In the 1960s, the Cranks vegetarian restaurant in London's Carnaby Street revived it, gave it a name, and attached it to a countercultural movement that had nothing to do with wartime necessity. The Land Army women would have found that baffling. They would have used meat if they could have got any. The women who made it out of shortage are gone. The dish they made out of nothing is now made by people who chose not to use meat. The irony is not lost. In Westmoreland, the territory the maps now call Cumbria, they were the last people in the country to still put real meat in their mincemeat, and they made no apology for it. The sweet lamb mincemeat pie held finely chopped lamb or mutton, dried fruit, apple, spices, and sweet, exactly as mincemeat had been made for centuries before the meat gradually got left out and everyone forgot it had been there. Westmoreland held on. The pies were eaten year-round, not only at Christmas. What those old cooks knew, and the rest of England had lost, was that meat fat combined with sweetened fruit and warm spice produced a richness that fruit mincemeat could only approximate. You tasted one made the right way and understood immediately why the meat had ever been there. Most people alive today have never had mincemeat with meat in it. The grandmothers who guarded the old ratio are gone, and what they knew went with them. The gala pie sat on every buffet table in the colliery villages and mill towns of Yorkshire and the Midlands from the 1930s through to the 70s. The round of hard-boiled egg running through the cold pork was sealed in a raised hot water crust that held its shape all afternoon. Made for funerals, works outings, wedding breakfasts, and the Miners' Welfare Club spread, it required a cook who understood the raised crust and worked it with confidence. The jelly that set inside was the test. If it was too loose, the slices fell apart. Every pit village had a woman who made them best. You knew who she was. The politics of whose gala pie appeared at a significant occasion were not simple. Those women are mostly gone. The supermarket sells a version in a plastic tray. It is not the same thing. Along the Lynn Peninsula and the Gower coast, where the Atlantic came in hard and the mussel beds were thick in the estuaries at low tide, there was a pie the rest of the country never quite found. Mussel and leek, shellfish gathered at the tide's edge, scrubbed clean, steamed open in a wide pan, the liquor kept, the mussels folded with sweated leeks, and a little cream into a filling that smelled of the sea and the winter field together. Leeks grew in the small holdings and kitchen gardens the length of Wales, and the combination of the sweet cooked allium with briny shellfish was one of those pairings that feels inevitable the moment you taste it. The mussels from the Menai Strait were considered the finest in Wales, gathered by hand from the beds beneath the suspension bridge. This was community food, made for harvest suppers, the chapel tea, any occasion that needed to taste of exactly where you were. That kind of cooking does not survive being moved. It stops making sense the moment it leaves the place that built it. It cost almost nothing, and it meant everything. The potato and dripping pie was the bottom of the larder made into a meal. Allotment potatoes sliced thin, layered in a dish with salt and black pepper, and the last of the beef dripping spread between each layer, a thin, short crust on top, into the oven for an hour until the crust went pale gold and the potato cooked through in its own steam. The dripping came from the roasting tin, the Sunday joints rendered fat, collected and stored in a stone crock, cloudy and salted, a flavour that no modern substitute can replicate. Families in the northern industrial towns made this through the lean years and kept making it into the 1950s, because the habit of economy ran deeper than the end of any shortage. Your nan made this pie, or, if not this pie exactly, something built on the same logic, made from what was there, without measuring, eaten without any sense. It was inadequate. It fed people who had nothing to spare, and it tasted like something real. The dripping tin is gone. She is gone. The pie went with her. But if the dripping pie fed the lean days quietly, the Denby Dale pie announced itself to all of Yorkshire. First made in 1788 in the West Riding village of Denby Dale to celebrate George III's recovery from illness, it was baked again on every occasion the village considered worth marking, such as Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, the end of the First World War, and the coronation of George VI. Each time the pie grew. The 2000 version measured 12 meters long and contained 5,000 kilograms of beef, 2,000 kilograms of potato, and 1,000 kilograms of onion. A pie at that scale could be nothing but communal. It required the whole village to prepare and eat it. You brought your own plate, joined the queue, and stood in a field with your neighbours, part of a tradition stretching back 2 centuries. The idea that a village could call a pie its own and bake it as a mark of shared identity, that quality has almost entirely left British food culture. There was a time when the liver and onion pie appeared on the table without discussion, because liver was cheap, and a cook who knew her craft could turn half a pound of pig's liver into something that fed 4 people well. The liver had to be sliced thin, soaked in cold milk for half an hour to draw the bitterness out, then floured and browned quickly before the onions went in, cooked slow until sweet, the two meeting in a pan-juice gravy with a little stock. Under short crust, it baked into something rich and dense and deeply savoury that cost almost nothing. Soaking was not optional. The browning had to be fast, or the liver went grey and grainy. Neither instruction was written anywhere. You learned by watching. Once liver fell out of fashion and cheaper cuts filled the butcher's window, the knowledge of how to cook it properly faded, and when the knowledge went, the pie went with it. Cawl is the oldest dish in Wales, a broth of lamb, leek and root vegetables that fed the country through hard winters, long before anyone thought to write it down, and in some kitchens it came sealed under pastry. The cawl pie was not a reinvention. It was a practical decision, a way to use what was left and to stretch the meal further. The lamb was the Welsh mountain breed, smaller and leaner than the lowland animal, its flavour sharpened by thin upland pasture, slow cooked with root vegetables, and a great deal of leek until the broth thickened. The pastry case held it all, and the steam trapped inside kept the filling richer than any open dish could manage. The leeks were the point. You could not make call with anything else. The older cooks were emphatic about that, the way people are emphatic about things they learned young and never questioned. There is no written rule. There never was one. The pigeon and steak pie was the Victorian kitchen's answer to a recurring problem. Game birds alone rarely had enough body to carry a pie filling, but the flavour they brought was something no butcher's cut could replicate. The solution was elegant, a layer of thin-cut beefsteak lining the bottom of the dish, providing structural richness and gravy depth, the pigeon breasts laid on top, sealed under short crust, and baked long and slow. You needed to know which pigeons were right for it, only young wood pigeons taken in summer, not the tougher autumn birds, which gave a stronger flavour that overwhelmed the steak. That judgment was never written in any recipe, in the great houses of Yorkshire and the Midlands. This was a game larder pie, the birds that fell to the kitchen after the shoot, the steak that stretched the estate's provisions one meal further. The cook who knew which steak to use against which bird had learned it over years of making. That knowledge left the kitchen when she did. Scotland's relationship with the herring shaped entire communities along the north and west coasts, and in those kitchens, a tradition of baking it into pies developed that the English lowlands never quite adopted. It was not delicate cooking. Fresh herring, cleaned and laid whole into a pie dish, layered with oatmeal and onion and seasoned with pepper and vinegar, then sealed under short crust, or in parts of the Highlands, a suet crust that soaked up the oil the fish released. The oil was the point. Herring baked in an enclosed pie stayed moist and rich in a way no open dish achieved, and the oatmeal thickened the cooking liquid into something close to a gravy. By the time the herring shoals shifted in the 1960s and the great Scottish fishing industry contracted, the domestic tradition had already faded. The fish that had been cheap enough to build a meal around was no longer arriving at the quayside in the quantities that made it the everyday choice it once had been. Long before the herring fed the coasts, the pit towns of northern England were finding their own ways to make something extraordinary from parts the market did not prize. The ox-heart pie asked the cook to take what nobody else wanted: the whole heart of the animal, dense and muscular, flavour deeper than any roasting joint, and transform it through long, slow braising into a filling tender enough to eat without a knife. You blanched it first, then braised it 3 hours or more in stock with root vegetables until the tight muscle fibres opened and the whole thing yielded. Into the pie dish it went with the reduced braising liquid under thick short crust, another hour in the oven. It cost almost nothing at the butcher's. The women who understood how to prepare it, who knew exactly how long the blanching needed, who could judge by pressing whether it was ready for the pastry, turned something the market had passed over into the best thing on the table. That knowledge does not transfer in a recipe. It lived in those hands and went with them. At Christmas, in households that kept to the old ways, the goose giblet pie came the day after the roast, a second meal made from what the bird had left behind, and often a better one than the first. The neck, gizzard, liver and heart simmered for hours on the back of the range with onion, carrot and thyme, the broth darkening slowly until the kitchen filled with a low, savoury warmth. Peter Breers, documenting domestic records of northern English households, confirmed this as a sustained tradition through the 19th century. The giblets were often enriched with beef or mutton steak and finished under pastry. It was the cook's reward for a long Christmas, made at her own pace for the people who remained after the main celebration had passed. What ended it was not a loss of appetite, but a change in how poultry arrived in the kitchen, bagged, portioned, clean to the point of being unrecognizable as a creature that had once possessed a neck or a gizzard. The giblets stopped coming. The quiet second Christmas meal is the one nobody remembers to miss. The cold water crust miner's pie was not a recipe. It was a structural problem solved so many times, over so many generations, that the solution had become instinct. You needed a pastry that would survive inside a snap tin in a jacket pocket, carried down a shaft before first light, intact through 8 hours underground, and still worth eating at the end of it. The hot water crust, lard poured into boiling water, then mixed into flour and worked quickly before it set, produced a case dense enough to hold under pressure and thick at the base so it could stand without support. In the pit villages of Yorkshire and Lancashire, each family's crimp was its own. The way the lid folded and pressed, the spacing of the finger marks, the angle of the edge. You could identify a pie in the dark by the crimp alone. You knew whose hands had made it before you opened it. That specific knowledge, that precise fold, stopped the day those hands stopped. The sweet harvest lamb and prune pie was tied to the agricultural calendar, the way most modern eating is not tied to anything at all. Made for the harvest supper that followed the last cutting, it combined late summer neck of lamb with dried prunes softened overnight in cider and a handful of mixed spice, all baked under a twice glazed short crust. The sweetness was not accidental. That tradition ran from medieval Britain through to the mid-20th century. A little sweetness in a meat pie was craft, sugar and spice, sharpening savoury flavours rather than masking them. Women in the farming communities of Herefordshire and the Marches made this every year for the supper that brought the whole village into the same room after a long season of separate work. The last people who made it understood the prune to lamb ratio without measuring it. They are gone from those kitchens, and the harvest suppers that called for the pie have mostly gone with them. What survives is a recipe, disconnected from the occasion that made it matter. Every family had a pie that nobody wrote down, not because it was a secret, but because the person who made it did not think of it as something requiring documentation. It was just what she made. A combination of whatever the larder held, a filling that changed with the season, a crust that varied with how full the lard tin was. You could describe it, you could list the approximate contents. But what you could not recover was the instinct behind it, the temperature at which she judged the fat was ready, the thickness she rolled the pastry to without thinking, the way it was seasoned from decades of small adjustments nobody ever named. Every attempt to recreate it produces something similar, never the same. The pie nobody wrote down cannot be fully recovered because what made it was not the recipe, it was the person. These pies fed us. If you liked what you saw today, the comments section is all the recipe book we have left.